Well, should we start with kind of the big Davos picture? Because everyone comes here to get a sense of, where the world is right now. And I guess starting with the economics, threats of recession, concerns about divergent paths for globalization, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, where do you see it right now?
I don't think we're in quite the negative space we were in a couple of months ago. They've done a survey which says that 2/3 of economists are predicting a global recession next year. That seems a little on the dark side to me, because the news out of the US tends to point towards a soft landing. The news out of Europe doesn't point to a disaster anymore, which is what we were anticipating for this time of year. Germans running out of gas, hibernating German industry. And China is a disaster in many ways, and I think a real menace for global public health. But as far as the economy is concerned, it's the end of zero COVID, so the brakes are off, and we would expect a major rebound next year. Put those three together, and you've got 60% of the global economy, and it's not heading in the downward direction that we were worried about, I think. Huge centrifugal forces of a political kind. But in terms of just the basic growth dynamic for trade and investment, it's not as bad as it was looking 3 or 4 months ago.
But does it feel, as a professor, as a kind of historian who has specialised in World War I, World War II, those eerie moments before, the Magic Mountain and Thomas Mann and all of that, are you still kind of getting those worrying echoes now, or is it less now than it was 6 months, 12 months ago of kind of World War III?
I mean, the war in Ukraine feels very close if you're in Central Europe. If you're anywhere, I was just in Vienna, and it's the story that dominates everything else. It's on the news every single day. This is the story. So in those terms, we're kind of Balkan Wars, 1908, 1909. We're not in 1914 moment, because I think the real fear of atomic escalation has abated somewhat. I think we're beginning to get a sense of what the Russian limits are. But 2022 was incredibly scary. I mean, the Taiwan Straits escalation was dramatic. And I think what's also striking there is that come the G20 meeting in the autumn, what did Biden and Xi decide to do? Some serious talking. And we know it's serious because we don't know anything about what went on. And they weren't leaking, they weren't playing it for political points like they've been doing for the last year or so. So I think that points to a scenario of not détente, but I think de-escalation, or at least some awareness on the part of the key actors of just how dangerous the situation was getting. And I think that sense of a reset is palpable. It's a very different mood here from what it was in May last year. I mean, Davos in May last year was a campaigning site for the Ukraine and Poland. The whole thing was taken over by an anti-Russian campaigning mood. Doesn't seem to have that kind of vibe this time round.
And you mentioned China a second ago and public health. It is strange, isn't it? I mean, the numbers, to the extent that we know the numbers in China, are pretty extraordinary, and yet it's not discussed that much here in Davos, at least.
I think it may be the most rapidly spreading epidemic in history, because you're talking about 1.4 billion people hidden behind a shield of zero COVID, immuno-naive, suddenly exposed to Omicron, which is super infectious. It just ripped through. We're talking about hundreds of millions of infections in a matter of days. And we don't really know, I think, what comes out of that yet. And I am seriously concerned for this year that we are basically complacent about the pandemic story. Not just the China aspect of this, but the new variants coming out of the US, which overwhelm apparently all our existing immunity. Now, we're as bored as we could possibly be with the pandemic story. No one wants to go there. And I think that's a big driver of the kind of denial that we're in. Plus, the reality in the West, as we know, is one in which the normal life has returned. But if there's one thing that could really blow up our expectations of a good 2023, or at least a relatively less bad 2023, it would be a bad, highly infectious Delta lethality kind of variant coming from somewhere. And that would stop the show, as we know. That causes a huge downturn in the global economy.
So it hasn't gone away?
I'm afraid it hasn't. It seems, it's back. I mean, it's coming at us faster than ever before, arguably. We are just, I think, gambling that the resistance that we have already built up through multiple exposures is going to see us through. It may. We simply don't know. But that contingency, that sense of uncertainty itself is hard to keep focused on because it's so disconcerting. I mean, does it really mean that our summer holiday plans are contingent on bad medical news again? But I think a realistic assessment of the situation suggests they may be.
Gosh, I mean, final thing, I mean, Davos, you've been to a few Davoses now. I mean, first of all, how does this feel kind of in comparison with others? But also, does it still play a useful role, as far as you can tell, in in the world.
What's really striking to me is the shifting balance between the different players here. I was speaking to some Indians who are here, and there's a huge Indian presence at Davos. In the same way as the Indians were key to the G20 meeting in the autumn, anchoring really the compromise that was made that allowed the resolution on Russia. The Indians are a vast presence here, but what they notice is that everyone else is missing. So the Indians will tell you, now we rule the roost, but where are the G7? The only Western leader that's coming is Olaf Scholz of Germany. And so there's a weird sense in that they've inherited the Davos mantle at a moment when the old backers of the old Davos, the flat world, full globalization, Xi as the champion of the rules of the road, back in 2017, that world, that seems to have gone.
It's strange, isn't it? It's kind of, yeah. Well, anyway, Adam Tooze, thank you very much for talking to us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.